My husband abandoned me on the bathroom floor when I was 9 months pregnant because he said my poverty would hold him back. 19 years later, he barged into my son's birthday dinner demanding custody of a boy he had never met and threw a $500 check in my face. What he did not realize was that the exclusive Atlanta country club he was standing in did not just grant me entry, I owned the entire estate. Before I continue this story, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The heavy oak doors of the Magnolia Room at the Oakwood Country Club in Atlanta swung open with a violent thud. I was just raising my crystal glass to toast my son Malik on his 19th birthday when the sound shattered our peaceful evening. Standing in the doorway was Derek. 19 years had thinned his hair and thickened his waist, but his arrogant smirk remained exactly the same as the night he walked out on me. He wore a flashy suit that screamed new money and stood with his hands on his hips, taking in the opulent surroundings of the private dining room. "I knew I would find you here spending my old alimony," Derek announced, his voice booming across the room. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the silver platters and imported floral arrangements. "You always did have a taste for things you could not afford, Maya. It is frankly embarrassing that you had to sneak into a place like this just to pretend you have a life." He walked closer to the table, completely ignoring the shocked expressions of the few close friends we had invited. He looked down at Malik, who was sitting calmly at my right. "So this is the boy," Derek said, crossing his arms. "I suppose you brought him here to show him how the other half lives before he goes back to the ghetto." I did not raise my voice. I gently placed my glass back onto the white linen tablecloth and looked at the man who had abandoned us. Derek was entirely oblivious to the reality of the situation. He did not notice that the general manager of the club was standing respectfully in the corner, ready to throw him out at my slightest nod. More importantly, Derek completely failed to recognize that the suit Malik was wearing was a custom-tailored Tom Ford masterpiece worth more than the cheap sports car Derek had parked out front. Malik did not flinch. My son simply wiped his mouth with a napkin and stared at the stranger who contributed nothing but DNA to his existence. "Look at him," Derek scoffed, shaking his head. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. "I heard you were struggling, Maya. 19 years is a long time to live on pennies, and I am a generous man." He tossed the paper onto the table right next to my son's plate. It was a check for $500. "Take this, and buy the boy some decent clothes," Derek commanded loudly, ensuring everyone in the room could hear his supposed charity. "Do not let him walk around looking like a thug from the streets. You need to dress him better if he is ever going to make something of himself." I looked at the crumpled check and then back at Derek. The sheer audacity of his presence after nearly 2 decades of absolute silence was almost amusing. He actually believed he was playing the role of the savior stepping in to rescue a desperate woman and her impoverished child. He had spent years telling his friends and his new family that I was a burden who would drag him down. Now he wanted to play the hero for an audience. "You are making a terrible mistake, Derek," I said, my voice quiet, but laced with an icy authority. "You should pick that up and leave before you embarrass yourself further." Derek threw his head back and let out a harsh laugh that echoed loudly against the expensive wood-paneled walls. "I am not going anywhere, Maya," he declared. "I came here to claim what is mine, and no one can stop me." He leaned over the table, placing both of his hands on the expensive linen cloth, staring fiercely into my eyes. "You have hidden my son from me for far too long," he whispered loudly. The wealthy patrons around us began to stare. "This boy needs a real man to teach him about the real world. You are just a very bitter woman." I barely had time to process his ridiculous statement before another figure stepped into the doorway behind him. It was a tall man with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smug expression that seemed permanently etched onto his face. He wore a navy blazer that looked expensive but lacked the bespoke fit of true luxury. This was Preston, the older brother of Derek's new wife. Preston walked into the room with an air of absolute ownership, as if he had just purchased the entire building. He looked at the elegant table settings, and then his gaze landed on Malik and me. His eyes held that familiar, condescending pity that I had seen far too many times in the corporate world. Maya, it is a pleasure to finally meet you, Preston said, extending a hand that I did not take. Derek has told me so much about your struggles. It takes a lot of resilience to raise a child in your kind of neighborhood. I simply stared at his outstretched hand until he awkwardly pulled it back and shoved it into his pocket. Derek beamed with pride, gesturing to Preston like he was showing off a shiny new toy. Preston is a senior partner at the investment firm where I am now a regional director, Derek boasted. He comes from a very prominent family. They have been incredibly generous in helping me build a stable environment, something I never had in our marriage. Preston chuckled, shaking his head with a look of faux humility. Now, Derek, do not make me sound like a saint, Preston said. We just believe in giving back to the less fortunate. It is part of our family ethos. Preston then turned his attention entirely to Malik. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the back of an empty chair, and studied my son like he was a charity case in a brochure. You know, son, you are a very articulate-looking young man, Preston said slowly, emphasizing the word articulate, as if it was a shocking accomplishment. Derek tells me you are taking some classes at a community college. That is a good start, it really is. But in the real world, you need practical skills. You need to understand how business works from the ground up. Malik remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. He did not look angry or intimidated. He just looked deeply bored. Preston mistook his silence for awe and continued his savior monologue. Our firm is currently running an initiative to help at-risk youth from disadvantaged backgrounds, Preston explained with a wide, patronizing smile. We teach them the value of hard work. I was talking to Derek and we agreed that we could bring you on as an intern. Of course you would not be doing any actual financial work, but you could help out in the server room, organize the files, empty the trash cans, run out to get coffee for the executives. It builds character. Plus, being around successful people might rub off on you. Derek pointed a finger at the crumpled check he had thrown onto the table earlier. That is exactly why I gave you that $500, Maya. Derek said, his voice filled with self-righteous authority. You need to take that money and buy the boy some decent clothes. He cannot show up to a prestigious investment firm looking like he just rolled out of bed. He needs khakis and a polo shirt, something presentable. The sheer magnitude of their ignorance hung heavily in the air. Preston and Derek stood there radiating a toxic mixture of arrogance and superiority, completely unaware of how incredibly foolish they sounded. They were lecturing us about poverty and presentation while standing inches away from my son, who was wearing a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit that cost more than Derek's entire monthly salary. The fabric alone was a silk-wool blend sourced directly from Italy, but these men lacked the refinement to even recognize it. They looked at a young black man and saw only their own prejudices. They assumed because of who he was and who I was, that he must be wearing cheap fast fashion. I looked at the $500 check sitting next to Malik's plate. That amount would not even cover the cost of the silk pocket square resting neatly in Malik's breast pocket. It was a staggering display of the white savior complex combined with Derek's desperate need to feel superior. They had crashed a private birthday dinner armed with microaggressions and loose change, expecting us to fall to our knees in gratitude. Malik finally broke his silence. He reached out and picked up the check between his index finger and thumb, inspecting it like it was a fascinating piece of trash. Before Malik could even utter a single word in response to the insulting offer, the heavy oak doors burst open for a second time. The loud thud echoed through the dining room, drawing the attention of every wealthy patron present. In walked Beverly, Derek's mother, clutching a designer handbag that looked entirely out of place against her overly dramatic demeanor. She paused dramatically at the threshold, ensuring all eyes were on her, before she let out a loud theatrical gasp. She brought a hand to her chest and began to produce loud sobbing noises, though her eyes remained entirely dry. "Oh, my sweet, precious grandson," she wailed, her voice carrying across the silent room. She practically sprinted toward our table, pushing past a waiter and ignoring the stunned expressions of our guests. She threw her arms wide and lunged at Malik, attempting to pull him into a suffocating embrace. Malik did not flinch, but he smoothly leaned back just enough so that Beverly's hands awkwardly grasped the empty air and the back of his chair. Beverly recovered quickly, seamlessly transitioning from the spurned grandmother to the tragic victim. She turned her sharp gaze toward me, her fake tears instantly vanishing to reveal the cold, calculating stare I remembered so well. "How could you, Maya?" she demanded loudly, ensuring the surrounding tables could hear every word. "How could you keep this beautiful boy away from his own flesh and blood for 19 years? We have been searching everywhere for him. Derek has cried himself to sleep countless nights wondering where his only child was. You moved from one bad neighborhood to another, just to hide him from us out of pure spite." I sat perfectly still. The audacity of her lies was breathtaking. 19 years ago, Beverly had stood in my cramped hospital room and told me that her son had a bright future, that my pregnancy was a trap, and that I should not expect a single dime from their family. She changed her phone number the week after Malik was born. Yet here she was performing a heartbreaking monologue for an audience of strangers, painting herself as the grieving matriarch robbed of her family. "You are a bitter and selfish woman," Maya Beverly continued, her voice rising in pitch. "You wanted to punish Derek because he built a wonderful life without you. But look at what your jealousy has done to this poor boy. You have deprived him of a father, a grandmother, and a life of privilege." She turned back to Malik, smiling sweetly. "But that is all over now, sweetie," she cooed, reaching out to pat his arm. Malik smoothly shifted his arm, resting his hands on the table. Beverly ignored the rejection and kept talking. "Your father is a very important man now, Malik. He is a regional director. He makes more money in a month than your mother makes in 5 years. And Preston here is practically royalty in the financial world. You do not have to struggle anymore. You do not have to go to those cheap community college classes. They are offering you an internship at a highly successful investment firm. This is your ticket out of the gutter. You need to come work for your father. Let him show you how to be a real man, a successful man. Do not let your mother's failures hold you back any longer. We can give you the world." The entire room was dead silent. Patrons stopped eating, engrossed in Beverly's spectacle. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and disdain, fully believing the narrative Beverly was spinning. They saw a wealthy, successful family desperately trying to save a lost young man from his bitter, impoverished mother. Derek stood tall, radiating extreme pride. He actually believed his mother was helping the situation. He thought this public shaming would force me into submission and compel Malik to beg for their charity. Preston nodded approvingly at Beverly's speech, enjoying the narrative of his own benevolence. It was a masterclass in manipulation and emotional abuse. They were attempting to rewrite history right in front of me, erasing their abandonment and replacing it with a heroic rescue mission. They wanted Malik to feel grateful for the crumbs they were finally willing to toss his way. They wanted me to feel small, insignificant, and defeated. But they were playing a game without knowing any of the rules. They had no idea that the young man sitting quietly at the table was not a helpless victim in need of saving. They had no idea that he had already built an empire that dwarfed their precious investment firm, and they certainly had no idea I owned their building. Malik, still holding the check, finally looked up, smiling calmly at Beverly. Malik, still holding the check, finally looked up, smiling calmly at Beverly. He did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of the anger they were so desperately trying to provoke. Instead, he neatly folded the $500 check perfectly in half, and then in half again, slipping it into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. "I think an internship at your firm sounds like a fascinating opportunity," Malik said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of the desperation they expected. "I would love to see exactly how your internal operations run. I can start on Monday morning." Derek let out a loud, triumphant breath, puffing out his chest as he looked at Preston. "You see that?" Derek said, clapping his hands together. That is what happens when you finally introduce some male authority into a boy's life. 19 years of living with a bitter woman, and he was headed nowhere. 5 minutes with us, and he is already making smart choices. Beverly clapped her hands together in dramatic delight. "Oh, praise the Lord," she exclaimed, looking up at the ceiling. "My grandson is finally coming home to his real family." Preston gave a slow, condescending nod, stepping closer to the table. "It is a good decision, son," Preston said, leaning heavily on the word son. "But do not think you are getting a free ride just because you share Derek's DNA. You are going to start at the absolute bottom. You will be organizing the archives, running cables in the server room, and taking lunch orders for the senior partners. You need to learn the true value of $1 before you can ever hope to sit at a desk in my building. Hard work builds character, especially for young men from your background. The real world does not hand out participation trophies." I sat back in my chair, letting their ignorant assumptions wash over me. I did not yell, I did not defend my honor, or explain that Malik was already managing assets they could not even comprehend. There is a specific kind of power in absolute silence, especially when your enemies are actively digging their own graves. I simply offered a polite closed-lip smile and raised my right hand slightly, lifting 2 fingers. Immediately, the general manager of the club practically materialized at my side. He held a leather-bound folio containing the bill for the evening's extravagant dinner. The total cost of the private room, the imported champagne, the caviar, and the custom menu was over $15,000. Everything was exceptional tonight. "Richard," I told the manager, keeping my voice soft but authoritative, "please ensure the kitchen staff is well taken care of." "Of course, madam," the manager replied, bowing his head respectfully. Derek scoffed, crossing his arms as he watched the exchange. "Do not try to act rich now, Maya," Derek sneered. "We all know you cannot afford a place like this. Who did you trick into paying for this dinner? Or are you planning to wash dishes in the back to cover the massive tab?" I ignored his pathetic taunts. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a solid titanium American Express Centurion card. The heavy black metal caught the dim light of the crystal chandelier above us. I placed it gently onto the leather folio. The manager took it with both hands and immediately turned to process the payment, without a single question. Preston let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "A black card," really, Preston mocked, looking at Derek. "They make some very convincing fakes these days." Or maybe she finally found some foolish man willing to max out his credit lines just to let her pretend she is part of the elite for one night. Derek sneered, leaning over the table again. "You are pathetic, Maya. You are probably drowning in credit card debt just to buy a single fancy dinner so you can trick Malik into thinking you are successful. That is exactly why I had to step in. You are completely financially irresponsible. You would rather go bankrupt trying to impress strangers than actually build a stable life for my son." I simply took a slow sip of my sparkling water, watching their delusions manifest in real time. They were so blinded by their own prejudice and massive egos that they could not see the absolute truth staring them right in the face. They assumed my silence was submission, and my calmness was utter defeat. But as I watched Preston hand Malik a cheap business card with the address of their investment firm, I knew the trap had been perfectly set. They had just invited a digital mastermind straight into their highly secure corporate network. They were handing him the keys to their entire fraudulent kingdom. "We will see you bright and early on Monday morning," Malik Preston said, buttoning his jacket smugly. "Wear a clean shirt. I look forward to it," Malik replied, his eyes glinting with a cold, calculated intelligence. "I guarantee you will never forget my time at your firm." Monday morning arrived with a crisp breeze, but the atmosphere inside the towering glass skyscraper of Preston and Derek's investment firm was suffocatingly sterile. Malik walked through the sliding double doors precisely at 8:30. He wore a simple pair of slacks and a button-down shirt, leaving the custom suit at home to play the part they expected. The receptionist barely glanced at him before pointing toward the corner office. Preston and Derek were waiting for him. They stood by a massive mahogany desk, drinking expensive espresso. Preston looked Malik up and down with a sneer of absolute superiority. "Look who decided to show up on time," Preston said, setting his cup down. "I was half expecting you to sleep in. Let us get one thing straight right now. You are here because Derek begged me to give you a chance. You are a diversity initiative for us. Do not think you are going to be handling client portfolios." Derek chimed in, crossing his arms tightly. "You need to learn the absolute basics, Malik. We are going to start you off in the archives and the server room down in the basement. You will organize the physical files, untangle the network cables, and make sure the senior partners have fresh coffee. Do you understand?" Malik offered a polite nod, keeping his face devoid of emotion. "I understand perfectly," Malik replied. Preston tossed a plastic keycard onto the desk. "The basement elevator is down the hall. Grab a trash bag from the supply closet on your way down." Malik picked up the keycard and walked out of the office. He could hear them chuckling as the door closed behind him. They thought relegating him to the forgotten basement was the ultimate humiliation. They had no idea they had just handed the keys to the castle to a digital ghost. The server room was exactly as they described it. It was a freezing, windowless cavern filled with rows of humming black towers. Malik locked the heavy metal door and dropped the trash bag into a corner. He walked over to the primary server rack, running his hand along the cold casing. He pulled out a small, sleek drive that contained software he had coded himself. It was a decryption engine designed to bypass enterprise-grade firewalls in seconds. He plugged the drive into a hidden port and opened his laptop. His fingers flew across the keyboard with blinding speed. Preston and Derek ran an investment firm that managed hundreds of millions of dollars, but their cybersecurity was laughably outdated. They had spent all their money on expensive office furniture, neglecting the digital walls protecting their assets. Within 3 minutes, Malik was past the primary firewall. Within 5 minutes, he had administrative access to every single terminal in the building. He was no longer the lowly intern fetching coffee. He was the absolute master of their entire network. As the data began to populate on his screen, a chilling picture emerged. Malik had expected to find some minor tax evasion. What he uncovered was a massive labyrinth of financial fraud. Preston and Derek were not brilliant investors. They were common thieves wearing expensive suits. Malik scrolled through thousands of hidden documents tracking the flow of money. They were siphoning funds from their largest clients, primarily blue-collar union pension funds, and routing the money through a complex web of offshore shell companies. The accounts were registered under fake names and hidden behind layers of corporate bureaucracy, but Malik tore through the encryption effortlessly. He found a secondary ledger hidden deep within a disguised system folder. The ledger detailed exactly how much Derek and Preston were stealing each month to fund their lavish lifestyles. The luxury cars, the private country club memberships, the expensive dinners, it was all paid for with stolen money. They were bleeding their clients dry and covering it up with falsified quarterly reports. Malik leaned back, listening to the server's hum. He watched the evidence compile into an ironclad digital dossier. They banished him to the basement, expecting him to sweep floors. Instead, he was quietly dismantling their empire bite by bite. He set up an automated script to copy every transaction to an encrypted cloud server. He was gathering the ammunition to destroy them completely. By 10, Malik locked his laptop and walked upstairs. He prepared 2 cups of dark roast coffee. He walked into their executive suite carrying the steaming cups. Preston took his coffee without saying thank you. "Good job, kid," Preston said without looking up. "Now get back downstairs and keep cleaning." Malik smiled a warm smile. "I will get right on that," Sir Malik said politely. He walked back to the elevator, holding the ultimate power over their lives, while they sipped the coffee. Later that week, my phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. It was Chloe, the new wife of Derek and younger sister of Preston. She invited me to a peacemaking luncheon at the Oakwood Country Club patio. It was the same club where we held Malik's birthday dinner. Chloe obviously assumed my previous display with the black card, was a desperate stunt funded by credit debt. I decided to entertain her invitation simply to observe their delusion. I arrived at the club driving my understated dark sedan, a custom armored vehicle that looked ordinary to the untrained eye, but cost more than Chloe's house. I handed the keys to the valet and walked onto the sunlit patio. Chloe was seated at a prominent table in the middle of the terrace. She wore a bright floral sundress and oversized sunglasses, trying desperately to project the image of a wealthy socialite. When she saw me, she waved frantically, drawing the attention of nearby tables. "Maya over here," she called out, echoing across the patio. I walked over and took my seat quietly. Chloe leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and gave me a look of exaggerated pity. "I am so glad you came, Maya," she sighed. "Derek and Preston told me about the arrangement with Malik. I wanted to sit down woman to woman and clear the air. We want to help you, we really do." I ordered chamomile tea and waited for the inevitable insults. "I saw you pull up in that little dark car." Chloe continued, her voice rising so the next table could hear. "It looks reliable for a struggling single mother, but it is not exactly safe. Derek and I would love to help you upgrade. We have an old SUV sitting in our garage. It is a few years old, but runs perfectly. We would be happy to sell it to you cheap, or set up a payment plan if you cannot afford it. You need something sturdy living in whatever dangerous neighborhood you are in right now." I simply picked up my teacup and took a slow sip. Chloe took my silence as an invitation to keep talking. She signaled a waiter for a mimosa and turned to my parenting. "Raising a young black man today must be terrifying for someone in your financial position," she said, shaking her head sadly. "Without a strong male figure around, it is easy for boys like Malik to fall in with the wrong crowd. You should be thanking God that Preston offered him that job in the basement. Getting him off the streets and into a corporate environment is exactly what he needs. It is about the culture. Malik needs to learn how to speak properly and dress appropriately to survive the real world. Preston is doing him a massive favor, exposing him to high society. A mother just cannot provide what a wealthy father can." I placed my teacup back onto its saucer. I did not frown or raise my voice to defend my neighborhood. I did not explain that my son was currently dismantling her brother's financial portfolio. I just looked at her. Chloe was completely blinded by her own privilege and her desperate need to feel superior to the black woman her husband left behind. She thrived on the idea that I was miserable. Her entire identity in this marriage was built on the foundation of my supposed failure. She needed me to be broken so she could feel whole. The audacity of her words hung in the air like a foul odor, ruining the beautiful afternoon. She was parroting the exact same racist talking points her brother used. They truly believed their whiteness and their stolen wealth made them the ultimate authorities on everything. "Are you even listening to me?" Chloe asked, sounding annoyed by my lack of emotion. "I am offering you the charity of our family, and you are just staring at me. It is incredibly rude. I can see exactly why Derek had to leave you. You have no grace and no appreciation for the people pulling you out of the mud." She slammed her hand down, causing her silverware to rattle. The noise drew stares from the wealthy patrons around us. "I am trying to fix the mess you made of your life," Chloe hissed, her face turning red. "You should be thanking me." The tea was warm and soothing, a perfect contrast to the toxic garbage spilling from her mouth. Let her talk, I thought. Every word was another nail in her coffin. The more she embarrassed herself in public, the sweeter the final victory would be. I smiled silently, enjoying my tea. This lunch was simply another glorious step toward their total destruction. My silence seemed to act as an accelerant for Chloe's mounting rage. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand against the wrought iron table, causing the crystal water glasses to rattle precariously. "I am speaking to you, Maya." She snapped, her voice echoing across the pristine terrace. "Do you lack basic manners, or are you simply too uneducated to formulate a response to my generosity?" Her volume had reached a level that was entirely unacceptable for the Oakwood Country Club. Around us, the gentle hum of polite conversation died out completely. Wealthy patrons turned in their seats, peering over their sunglasses to witness the spectacle Chloe was creating. She was oblivious to their disdain, interpreting their stares as an audience for her grand performance. She leaned in closer, her face contorted with ugly entitlement. "You need to understand your place in this dynamic," she hissed loudly. "My husband and my brother are giving your son a future. You owe us your absolute gratitude." Before she could launch into another tirade, a tall figure materialized beside our table. It was Richard, the general manager who had assisted me during Malik's birthday dinner. His posture was impeccably straight, and his expression was a mask of professional calm. "Excuse me, Madam," Richard said, his voice smooth but firm. "I must ask that you lower your voice. You are disturbing the other members on the patio." Chloe whipped her head around, looking at Richard as if he were a bug she had just scraped off her expensive shoes. "Excuse me," she scoffed. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to?" "I am Chloe. My brother is Preston and my husband is Derek. We are premium members here. We spend thousands of dollars at this establishment every single month." Richard did not blink. "I understand that, madam," he replied politely. "However, our club maintains strict policies regarding the comfort and peaceful enjoyment of all our guests. I must insist that you keep your conversation at an appropriate volume." Chloe's face flushed a vibrant shade of crimson. Her care and instincts took over completely, overriding whatever tiny fraction of social grace she possessed. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she screeched, standing up from her chair. "I am a paying member. You are just a glorified waiter. I want your name and I want your supervisor's name right now. I will have you fired by the end of the day. You will never work in hospitality again. If anyone is disturbing the peace, it is her." She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "She does not even belong here. She drove here in a piece of junk car, and she is probably putting this entire lunch on a maxed-out credit card. Kick her out immediately." The sheer entitlement radiating from her was almost cinematic. She stood there, chest heaving, believing her proximity to white wealth gave her the power to bend the world to her will. She expected Richard to cower, apologize profusely, and perhaps even physically remove me from the premises to appease her fragile ego. Instead, Richard completely ignored her demands. He did not flinch at her threats, nor did he acknowledge her pointing finger. He smoothly pivoted his body, turning his back slightly toward Chloe to face me directly. He offered a respectful bow of his head. "Ma'am," Richard said, his tone shifting from professional detachment to absolute deference, "would you like me to cancel their family membership?" Chloe froze. Her hand dropped slowly to her side. "What did you just say?" she stammered, her voice suddenly losing its venomous edge. "You cannot cancel my membership. I will call the owner." Richard finally looked back at Chloe, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "Madam, you are speaking to the owner. Maya is the majority shareholder of the Oakwood Hospitality Group, which owns this club and 6 other properties across Atlanta. She dictates the membership roster." The color drained from Chloe's face so fast, I thought she might actually faint. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The arrogant sneer she had worn all afternoon melted into an expression of sheer, unadulterated terror. She looked at me, then at Richard, then back at me. All the pieces of the puzzle she had willfully ignored suddenly snapped together. The black card at dinner, my calm demeanor, the way the staff hovered around me with ultimate respect. I took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the taste and the stunning silence that had finally fallen over our table. I placed the cup down and looked right into her panicked eyes. "Cancel it, Richard," I said softly. "And please escort my guest to the parking lot. She seems to have lost her appetite." I left the country club that afternoon feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. Watching Chloe stumble toward the parking lot in utter disgrace was a beautiful preview of the destruction to come. But I knew their family would not surrender easily. Cornered animals always lash out, and Derek and Preston were no exception. My phone rang the next morning while I was reviewing an acquisition portfolio in my home office. The caller ID flashed with Derek's name. I answered the call and put it on speaker, letting his frantic voice fill the room. Maya, we have a massive problem. Derek barked, his voice laced with manufactured panic. You need to come down to the firm right now. Your son has really done it this time. I leaned back in my leather chair, keeping my breathing perfectly even. What exactly has Malik done? Derek, I asked calmly. Preston just did a security sweep of the server room. Derek explained, speaking entirely too fast. Someone bypassed the firewalls and accessed highly sensitive client files yesterday. And worse, a company laptop containing proprietary trading algorithms is completely missing from the basement inventory. Malik was the only person down there, Maya. He is the only one who had the opportunity. The sheer predictability of their strategy almost made me laugh. Preston had likely noticed a tiny blip in his server logs. Paranoia regarding his massive embezzlement scheme had instantly set in. Instead of conducting a real investigation, his inherent racism and arrogance led him straight to the easiest scapegoat. He saw a young black man working in his basement and immediately profiled him as a thief. It was a pathetic attempt to cover their own tracks by framing my son. Are you accusing Malik of corporate espionage, Derek? I asked, letting a hint of amusement bleed into my words. I am stating the facts, Maya. Derek snapped loudly. Preston is furious. He wants to call the police right now and press felony charges. Do you have any idea what this means? Malik is looking at 10 years in federal prison. His life will be completely over before it even begins. He will have a felony record. He will never get a real job. And what exactly do you want from me? I asked, perfectly aware that a demand was coming. Derek lowered his voice, attempting to sound like a compassionate savior making a painful sacrifice. I talked Preston down temporarily, Derek said. I convinced him to hold off on calling the authorities, but he wants blood, Maya. I can make this entire problem disappear. I can replace the missing laptop out of my own pocket and scrub the security logs, but I need something from you in return to justify sticking my neck out for a kid who clearly hates us. I am listening, I replied, staring at the ceiling. I am emailing you a legal document right now. Derek said, his tone shifting from frantic to cold and calculated. It is a standard custody and financial waiver. It states that you forgive all past due child support for the last 19 years. It also grants me retroactive 50% legal custody of Malik. The pieces fell into place perfectly. Derek was facing an upcoming audit. He needed to project the image of a stable, dedicated family man to his investors and board members. A sudden reconciliation with his estranged son, complete with a legally binding custody agreement, would be a massive public relations victory for him. He was using a fabricated felony charge to extort me into giving him the perfect reputation. So let me get this straight, I said slowly. You want me to erase 19 years of your financial neglect and give you legal rights to a grown man just so you can pretend to be a good father for the cameras. And if I refuse, you will have your racist brother-in-law frame Malik for a crime he did not commit. Do not play the victim here, Maya. Derek sneered defensively. Your son is a thief. It is in his blood. He comes from your side of the tracks. I am offering you a golden ticket to save him from a prison cell. You have exactly 1 hour to sign that document and bring it to my office. If you are not here by noon, Preston is calling the police and having Malik arrested. Make the smart choice for once in your life. He hung up the phone, leaving a heavy silence in my office. I looked at my phone. Derek believed he had me trapped. He thought I was a desperate mother who would sign away her dignity to protect her son from a broken justice system. He had no idea that Malik was not a helpless target. I did not even dignify his ridiculous ultimatum with a verbal response. I pressed the red button and ended the call. Let them wait and sweat, I thought quietly. Let them stare at the clock as noon approaches and passes, realizing that their cheap intimidation tactics hold absolutely no power over me. When noon passed, Derek realized his private extortion scheme had completely failed. But men like him possess dangerous narcissism and desperation. Since he could not control me in private, he dragged our lives into the unforgiving public eye. By early Tuesday morning, Derek had launched a full-scale aggressive media assault. He did not call the police to report the missing laptop because he knew a real investigation would expose his own fraud. Instead, he immediately took his entirely fabricated tragedy straight to social media and local news outlets. He sat down for an exclusive interview with a popular Atlanta morning show, broadcasting his lies to millions of viewers. He wore a modest sweater instead of his usual flashy suits, perfectly playing the role of the humble, heartbroken father. He looked directly into the television camera, squeezing out a single highly calculated tear. For 19 years, I have been fighting a silent battle, Derek told the sympathetic news anchor. I have tried everything to be in my son's life, but his mother locked me out. She was bitter that my career took off. She wanted to punish me. But the real victim here is my boy. He painted a picture of Malik as a misguided youth wandering aimlessly down a dark path, all because he lacked a strong male role model. He conveniently left out his own abandonment, the unpaid child support, and the fact that he was currently attempting to frame this so-called beloved son for a felony. I recently reached out and offered the boy an amazing internship at my financial firm. Derek continued shaking his head sorrowfully. I wanted to teach him the business. I wanted to save him from the streets. But his mother has poisoned his mind against me. Now he is making terrible choices, and I am just a desperate father begging for the chance to guide him before the justice system takes him away entirely. The interview went viral within hours. Clips circulated across every major social media platform, accompanied by hashtags demanding justice for Derek. The narrative struck a powerful nerve within the community. The public conversation immediately fractured, completely split by Derek's manipulative performance. Half of the community saw right through his sudden appearance, questioning where this dedicated father had been for the past 2 decades. But the other half eagerly swallowed his lies, completely embracing the harmful trope of the bitter, angry baby mama who weaponizes her child against a successful black man. My social media accounts were flooded with hateful messages from strangers. People who had never met me called me toxic, selfish, and destructive. They accused me of ruining my son's future simply to satisfy a petty grudge. Even a few distant relatives called to express their disappointment, urging me to put my pride aside and let Derek help Malik. The pressure was designed to break me. Derek wanted to isolate me completely, hoping the public shaming would force me to publicly surrender and hand over the custody papers he so desperately needed for his impending corporate audit. He wanted me to scramble to defend myself, to issue frantic statements or post angry rebuttal videos. He expected a loud, messy public feud because that is the only language he truly understands. But I gave him absolutely nothing. I maintained a total media blackout. I did not issue a single comment to the press. I did not lock my social media accounts or delete the hateful comments. I let them sit there, a digital monument to Derek's massive deception. Malik and I sat in our living room that evening, watching the news segment replay on the television. Malik calmly drank his green smoothie, seemingly unfazed by the fact that his biological father was branding him a budding criminal on national television. "Are you going to let him keep talking?" Malik asked, gesturing casually toward the television screen. I smiled and picked up my tablet, reviewing the latest batch of decrypted financial files Malik had extracted from their servers. "Yes, I am going to let him talk," I replied. "When your enemy is busy hanging himself, you do not interrupt him to ask about the quality of the rope." Derek thinks he is building a fortress of public sympathy, but all he is really doing is ensuring that when the truth finally comes out, his fall from grace will be spectacular, public, and entirely inescapable. Let him enjoy his moment in the spotlight. Our time is coming. Derek, however, was not the only member of his family desperate for attention and public validation. His mother, Beverly, saw the viral interview and decided she needed her own piece of the sympathy pie. While Derek focused on local news channels and social media, Beverly took her campaign directly to the community. She embarked on a church tour across Atlanta, visiting the largest congregations in the city. Her goal was to weaponize religion, playing the heartbroken grandmother denied access to her only grandchild by a wicked woman. By Sunday morning, her performance had reached its peak. She was scheduled to speak at Greater Faith Fellowship, a church with thousands of active members. I knew she would be there because several women from my own social circles attended that congregation and had warned me about Beverly's upcoming testimony. I decided it was time to attend service. I dressed in a simple but impeccably tailored navy dress and arrived just as the choir was finishing their opening hymns. I slipped into a pew near the back of the massive sanctuary, blending in with the crowd. I sat quietly holding a thick leather-bound folder in my lap. The pastor eventually took the microphone and invited Beverly to the altar. He introduced her as a woman carrying a heavy spiritual burden who needed the prayers of the righteous. Beverly walked up the carpeted steps, clutching a lace handkerchief. She wore a modest white suit, playing the part of the devout elder perfectly. She gripped the wooden podium and looked out over the sea of faces. Her voice trembled right on cue as she began to weave her web of lies. She spoke about the sanctity of family and the deep pain of alienation. She told the congregation that she spent 19 years praying every single night for the safe return of her grandson. She painted me as a godless woman who stole a child out of spite and refused to let a loving father and grandmother provide for him. "I weep for the soul of the woman holding my grandson hostage," Beverly cried out, wiping a completely dry eye with her handkerchief. "I pray that the Lord softens her hardened heart and allows this boy to know the love of his real family before the streets consume him." The congregation hummed with sympathetic murmurs. Several people raised their hands in prayer, completely captivated by her emotional manipulation. She was feeding off their energy, using their genuine faith to validate her toxic delusions. I decided she had spoken long enough. I stood up from my seat in the back row. The sanctuary was enormous, but my movement caught the attention of the ushers standing nearby. I stepped into the center aisle and began to walk toward the altar. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who knows exactly who she is and what she holds. The rhythmic click of my heels against the polished hardwood floor echoed through the cavernous room, cutting through the ambient noise of the congregation. People began to turn their heads. Whispers rippled through the pews as recognition dawned on the faces of those who had seen the viral news interview. Beverly stopped speaking. She froze at the podium, staring down at me with wide, panicked eyes. The pastor stepped forward, looking confused by the sudden interruption. I reached the front of the church and climbed the short flight of stairs, standing just a few feet away from the woman who had spent the last 10 minutes assassinating my character in the house of God. The entire sanctuary fell completely silent. "You have asked the congregation to pray for my soul, Beverly," I said, my voice carrying clearly without the need for a microphone. "But I think they need to pray for your gambling addiction instead." I opened the leather folder and pulled out a thick stack of bank statements and wire transfer receipts. "For the past 5 years, you have called me sobbing every single month, begging for money to pay off the illegal bookies you owe. You lost Derek's money, you lost your own savings, and you came to the woman you claim to hate just to keep loan sharks away from your door." I dropped the heavy stack of papers onto the altar right next to her trembling hands. "These are the receipts for the $80,000 I secretly gave you to save your life while you ignored your grandson," I announced clearly. "You do not miss him. You just ran out of credit." Beverly stared at the papers, her face drained of all color. She gasped loudly, clutched her chest, and collapsed onto the floor, fainting right behind the pulpit as the entire congregation erupted into absolute chaos. I turned my back on the screaming choir and walked out of the sanctuary. The heavy wooden doors closed behind me, muffling the sounds of Beverly's spectacular public downfall. I walked to my car feeling completely unbothered. The church incident quickly became gossip across the city, and the perfectly crafted narrative Derek had built began to show visible cracks. But Derek and Preston were far too arrogant, and far too desperate to notice the shifting tides. They were completely consumed by their upcoming corporate charity gala. Their investment firm was quietly bleeding millions of dollars due to their gross mismanagement and reckless embezzlement. They desperately needed a massive injection of legitimate capital to keep their sinking ship afloat. Their entire future hinged on one man. They needed to secure a $50 million investment from a notoriously elusive billionaire named Mr. Sterling. The gala was nothing more than an extravagant trap designed specifically to impress him. The event was held in the grand ballroom of a luxury downtown hotel. I attended silently, wearing an elegant emerald gown, standing near the back of the room near the shadowed archways. Derek and Preston strutted across the marble floors like peacocks in their rented tuxedos. The room was filled with local politicians, wealthy socialites, and potential investors, but their eyes were locked entirely on Mr. Sterling. He was a distinguished older black man, sitting quietly at a VIP table, taking in the spectacle. Preston knew that Mr. Sterling was deeply passionate about community outreach and philanthropy. He wanted to see companies that actively uplifted marginalized voices. So Preston and Derek decided to weaponize my son once again. They pulled Malik aside near the kitchen doors just before the main speeches began. I watched from a distance as Preston shoved a folded piece of paper into Malik's chest. It was a pre-written speech. Preston pointed a threatening finger at my son, leaning in close to deliver his strict demands. They told him that if he did not read the script exactly as written, they would call the police and execute the felony charges regarding the missing laptop. They wanted to parade him in front of the billionaire as their ultimate charity project. They wanted Malik to stand on stage and declare himself an at-risk youth saved from a life of crime by the incredible generosity of their firm. It was a vile and deeply degrading demand. Most young men would have exploded with righteous anger or refused outright. But Malik simply looked at the piece of paper and gave Preston a polite nod. He did not argue or fight back. He did not show an ounce of fear. When the lights dimmed and the announcer called his name, Malik walked confidently up the steps to the main stage. He stood behind the crystal podium, looking out at the sea of wealthy faces. Derek and Preston stood near the front row, practically vibrating with smug anticipation. They looked like proud saviors waiting for their applause. Malik adjusted the microphone and looked down at the paper. He began to read. He delivered the speech with absolute perfection. He spoke about his humble beginnings and the lack of proper guidance in his young life. He praised Derek for stepping in when he needed a strong father figure the most. He thanked Preston for taking a major chance on a struggling kid from a bad neighborhood and giving him an opportunity to sweep floors at a highly prestigious firm. He played the part of the grateful, submissive victim flawlessly. His voice carried the exact emotional weight required to move the wealthy audience to tears. He looked directly at Mr. Sterling and smiled a warm, humble smile. The billionaire nodded slowly, listening intently to every single word. Preston puffed out his chest, clapping loudly as Malik finished the speech. Derek wiped a fake tear from his eye, putting his arm around his new wife Chloe, who was back to pretending she was high society. They felt immensely powerful in that moment. They truly believed they had completely broken my son. They thought their aggressive threats had terrified him into total submission. They thought they had secured their $50 million lifeline and cemented their public image as selfless community heroes. They watched Malik walk off the stage feeling entirely victorious. Preston gave Derek a high five, celebrating their supposed genius. They had absolutely no idea that Malik was not performing for them. He was performing for me. And the script he was following was part of a much larger, much more devastating play that was about to bring their entire fraudulent world crashing down around them. They were celebrating a massive victory on a ship that was already sinking fast into an ocean of very dark, cold water. The applause in the grand ballroom slowly faded into a low buzz of excited chatter. Derek and Preston stood near the edge of the stage, practically glowing with self-satisfaction. They adjusted their rented tuxedos and exchanged a look of pure triumph. In their minds, the trap had sprung perfectly. Malik had delivered the exact narrative they forced upon him, and the audience had swallowed every single word. They turned their attention toward the center of the room where the VIP tables were arranged. Mr. Sterling, the elusive billionaire they desperately needed, was slowly standing up from his seat. He was an imposing figure, an older black man with silver hair and a tailored charcoal suit that radiated quiet authority. He buttoned his jacket and began to walk toward the edge of the crowd. Preston immediately nudged Derek and pointed. "This is it," Preston whispered excitedly. "He is coming over to congratulate us. Get ready to talk numbers. We are going to lock in that $50 million investment tonight." Derek puffed out his chest and smoothed his tie. He plastered a wide, charming smile across his face and stepped forward ready to play the brilliant executive. The two men confidently strode across the marble floor, closing the distance between themselves and the billionaire. They pushed past a group of local politicians, barely offering an apology, so eager were they to secure their financial lifeline. As Mr. Sterling approached, Derek extended his right hand out, far offering a firm, confident greeting. "Mr. Sterling, it is an absolute honor," Derek announced, his voice booming over the ambient noise of the gala. "I am Derek, and this is my senior partner, Preston. We are the founders of the firm. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. As you can see, we are deeply committed to changing lives in our community." Preston stepped up right beside him, also extending a hand. "We would love to schedule a private meeting with you tomorrow morning to discuss our investment portfolio," Preston added, flashing his blindingly white smile. "We have some incredible opportunities that align perfectly with your philanthropic goals." They stood there with their hands outstretched, wearing eager, expectant smiles. They waited for the billionaire to grasp their hands and praise their incredible charity work. But the billionaire did not stop. He did not slow down. He did not even blink in their direction. Mr. Sterling walked right past them. He moved with a steady, deliberate pace, slicing through the crowd as if Derek and Preston were nothing more than empty air. The sheer force of his dismissal left them completely frozen. Derek's outstretched hand hovered awkwardly in the empty space. Preston's smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of utter confusion. They turned around, watching the back of Mr. Sterling's charcoal suit as he continued walking toward the rear archways of the ballroom. They were not the only ones watching. The sudden and blatant rejection caught the attention of several nearby guests. The room grew noticeably quieter as people tracked the billionaire's path. Derek felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. His mind raced frantically, trying to understand what had just happened. Had they offended him? Had Malik said something wrong during the speech? Derek took a step forward, intending to chase after the man, but Preston grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Wait!" Preston hissed, his eyes wide. "Look where he is going!" Derek followed Preston's gaze toward the dimly lit back corner of the grand ballroom. I was standing there quietly in my emerald gown, watching the entire scene unfold with absolute detachment. I had not moved since Malik gave his speech. I simply waited in the shadows, letting their arrogance carry them to the absolute edge of the cliff. Mr. Sterling stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. The imposing billionaire, the man holding the financial fate of their entire company in his hands, suddenly softened his posture. He did not extend a hand for a casual greeting. Instead, he clasped his hands in front of him and offered a deep, respectful bow of his head. "Boss," Mr. Sterling said, his deep voice carrying easily across the silent floor. "The acquisition papers are ready for your signature. The hostile takeover of their firm has been fully initiated." From across the room, I watched Derek's brain completely short-circuit. His jaw dropped open, and his eyes bulged as the word boss echoed through the elegant ballroom. The man he was begging for money, the billionaire he thought was going to save his fraudulent empire, was calling me his superior. Preston stumbled backward, bumping into a waiter and sending a tray of champagne glasses crashing to the floor. The loud sound of shattering glass punctuated the absolute destruction of their reality. The shattering glass broke the spell holding the ballroom captive. He turned sharply and bolted toward the heavy mahogany exit doors, leaving Derek standing frozen in the middle of the crowd. Preston's chest heaved with panicked breaths as he pushed into the dimly lit hallway outside. His expensive tuxedo was wrinkled and his hair was undone. He paced the corridor, his mind racing through catastrophic scenarios. The hostile takeover of his firm meant exposure. The offshore accounts, the stolen funds, and fabricated ledgers would be uncovered by Maya's accountants. He desperately needed leverage immediately. As he turned the corner near the coat check, he spotted Malik. My son was standing quietly by a marble pillar, holding a glass of sparkling water, checking his phone. He looked perfectly at ease, completely detached from the absolute chaos unfolding inside the ballroom. The sight of Malik's calm demeanor pushed Preston over the edge of rational thought. All the refined corporate elegance Preston pretended to possess evaporated in an instant, replaced by raw, desperate rage. Preston lunged across the hallway. He did not say a word before he closed the distance between them. He reached out with both hands and grabbed the lapels of Malik's custom jacket, slamming my son hard against the cold marble pillar. The glass of water slipped from Malik's hand and shattered on the floor, adding to the debris of the evening. Preston pressed his forearm against Malik's chest, pinning him in place. "Listen to me, you little street thug!" Preston hissed, his voice trembling with a toxic mixture of fear and pure hatred. "I do not care what kind of game your mother is playing in there. You are going to go back inside, and you are going to tell her to back off right now. If she signs those acquisition papers, I swear to God, I will destroy your entire life. You think you are so smart with your little computer tricks. I know exactly what you did in my server room. I will call the police tonight and tell them you stole our proprietary algorithms. I will have you arrested for corporate espionage before you even make it to the parking lot. I will make sure you get the maximum sentence. You will spend the best years of your life rotting in a federal prison while your mother watches." Malik did not struggle. He did not raise his hands to push Preston away or raise his voice to call for security. He simply looked down at the desperate red-faced man pinning him against the wall. The contrast between them was striking. Preston was entirely unhinged, sweating and spitting his words while Malik remained as still and cold as the marble behind him. "You do not belong in our world," Preston continued, spitting his racist venom without any restraint. "You and your mother are nothing but parasites trying to steal what we built. I am a senior partner at a multi-million-dollar firm. I have politicians on my payroll. I have judges who play golf at my country club. Who do you think the police are going to believe? They will take one look at you and they will lock you away without a second thought. You are just another statistic waiting to happen. Tell your mother to stop the takeover, or I will ruin you forever. Do you understand me, boy?" Preston shoved Malik harder against the pillar, breathing heavily, his eyes wild with desperation. He thought his physical intimidation and his threats of systemic violence would force Malik into a terrified submission. Malik stared at Preston for a long silent moment. Then Malik smiled. It was not a smile of fear or forced compliance, but a smile of absolute chilling victory. Malik slowly raised his hands not to fight back, but to gently pry Preston's trembling fingers off his jacket. Preston was so stunned by the calm reaction that his grip loosened naturally. Malik smoothed the fabric of his lapel, brushing away invisible dust. "You have politicians on your payroll," Malik repeated softly, his voice perfectly steady. "That is very interesting information, Preston. It is a good thing my tie clip has a high-definition noise-canceling microphone." Malik reached up and tapped the small, sleek silver bar holding his tie in place. A tiny blue light blinked twice, confirming the device was actively transmitting. "I have been recording this entire conversation," Malik explained, stepping away from the pillar. "The physical assault, the racial slurs, the explicit blackmail, and your open confession to bribing public officials. All of it was just broadcast live to the secure server I set up for my mother and her legal team. Your pathetic threats do not scare me, Preston, because you no longer have a firm to protect." Preston stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the blinking blue light on Malik's tie clip. The reality of his destruction finally pierced his arrogant delusion. He did not say another word. He simply turned and fled down the corridor, leaving the shattered glass and his ruined career behind. By the next morning, the financial world of Atlanta was turned upside down. My acquisition of their firm was finalized before the market even opened. The news shocked the corporate sector, but for Derek and Preston, the nightmare was just beginning. Their company accounts were frozen pending a massive federal audit. They were locked out of their own offices, and the offshore shell companies they used to hide stolen money were rapidly being dismantled by my team of forensic accountants. They were entirely backed into a corner with no way out. But men like Derek do not possess the capacity for self-reflection or accountability. Faced with the consequences of his actions, he doubled down on his most toxic trait. He decided to use the court system to force his way into my fortune. 3 days later, I received a stack of legal documents delivered to my home. Derek had filed a ridiculous emergency injunction in family court. He was officially petitioning a judge to legally force Malik to change his last name to match Derek's. It was an absurd maneuver since Malik was 19 years old and a legal adult, but Derek's logic was entirely fueled by desperate greed. He believed that if he could establish an ironclad retroactive paternal bond, he could somehow stake a claim to Malik's assets or use the familial tie as leverage to extort a massive financial settlement from me. He wanted to legally bind himself to the wealth he had mocked weeks prior. The court mandated a mediation session before a judge would even look at the circus Derek was trying to orchestrate. The mediation took place on a rainy Tuesday morning in a high-end conference room at a law firm. I arrived exactly on time wearing a tailored charcoal suit. I brought only one person with me, a quiet man in a plain gray suit carrying a single leather briefcase. We took our seats on one side of the massive oak table and waited. 10 minutes later, the doors swung open and Derek made his grand entrance. He was accompanied by Preston, who looked incredibly pale and sleep-deprived. But they were not alone. They marched into the room flanked by a team of 6 highly aggressive, expensive corporate lawyers. The legal team wore custom pinstripe suits and carried thick stacks of fabricated evidence. They spread their documents across the table with loud, intimidating thuds, trying to establish dominance before the mediator even sat down. Derek leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms with a smug, satisfied grin. He looked at my single companion and let out a sharp, patronizing laugh. "Is that the best you could afford, Maya?" Derek mocked, shaking his head. "I told you that you were in way over your head. You might have played a good game with your hostile takeover, but family law is a completely different battlefield. These men represent the top legal minds in the state of Georgia. We are going to tear you apart. We are going to expose you as a bitter, alienating mother, and the judge will grant me full paternal rights. Malik is going to take my name, and you are going to pay all my legal fees when this is over. We will take everything you own." Preston chimed in, leaning forward and pointing a pen directly at my face. "You thought you could just take our company and walk away?" Preston sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You thought you actually won, but we dug into your past. We know you have been hiding assets to avoid child support reporting. We are going to freeze your accounts just like you froze ours. We are demanding a full forensic audit of your personal wealth and a $10 million settlement for emotional distress and parental alienation. If you do not agree to our terms today, we will drag you through the mud so thoroughly that your reputation in this city will be utterly destroyed. You will be nothing." I sat still, listening to their empty threats bouncing off the walls of the elegant conference room. They had spent thousands of dollars. They did not actually have to hire an army of legal bullies hoping to terrify me into total submission. They thought they had finally found the ultimate trap. They thought their aggressive posturing and thick legal binders would make me crack under the immense pressure. I simply smiled, looked at Derek, and prepared to completely end this pathetic display. The lead attorney, a man with heavily gelled hair and an overly aggressive demeanor, opened his thick binder with a loud, dramatic snap. He did not bother with pleasantries or standard mediation introductions. He immediately launched into a vicious monologue designed entirely to intimidate me into a rapid settlement. He listed their demands with a theatrical voice pacing slightly behind Derek's chair. He threatened to subpoena every single financial record I possessed from my earliest tax returns to my most recent corporate acquisitions. He promised to hire private investigators to dig into my personal life and to drag my name through the mud of public opinion. We are prepared to call numerous character witnesses who will testify about your absolute unfitness as a mother, the lawyer declared, pointing a manicured finger across the table. We will argue that your obsessive focus on building your wealth constituted severe emotional neglect of your child. We will paint a picture of a cold woman who alienated a loving father purely out of spite. By the time we are finished with you in family court, your professional reputation in Atlanta will be entirely decimated. Investors will flee from your funds, and your empire will crumble under the weight of the scandal. Sign the agreement today, give my client what he rightfully deserves, and we can keep this entirely confidential. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Derek, who was nodding along with his lawyer's vicious threats like a proud emperor. The quiet man sitting to my left, the one in the plain gray suit, did not say a word either. He simply pulled a small yellow legal pad from his briefcase and began writing with a cheap plastic pen, ignoring the expensive legal team across from him. His lack of reaction seemed to infuriate Preston, who slammed his hand flat against the heavy oak table. "You think this is a joke?" Preston sneered, his voice still carrying the frantic edge of a man watching his life burn to the ground. "You think you are invincible because you bought our debt. You are nothing but a hostile corporate raider. We will tie you up in litigation for the next decade. You will bleed millions in legal fees just trying to defend yourself. We have nothing left to lose, Maya. We will burn everything down with us if you do not cooperate." Derek held up a hand signaling his brother-in-law to calm down. He wanted to play the magnanimous victor, offering a lifeline to his defeated enemies. He reached into his own leather portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of paper, sliding it across the polished wood table toward Malik. Malik had been sitting quietly on my right side, still wearing a casual sweater that sharply contrasted with the stiff suits filling the room. "Look, son," Derek said, his voice dripping with fake paternal affection. "I do not want to destroy your mother. I really do not. I am a reasonable man trying to protect my family name. We can make all of these lawsuits and audits disappear right now. I am willing to drop the custody petition and the demand for financial compensation. But there is one absolute condition." Derek tapped the paper lying in front of Malik. "This is a standard non-disclosure agreement." Derek explained, his eyes darting nervously toward the plain-suited man sitting next to me. "It simply states that you will never publicly or privately discuss anything you saw, heard, or did during your brief internship at my firm. It binds you to absolute confidentiality regarding our server architecture and our client files. Sign that paper, Malik. Keep your mouth shut about our internal operations, and I will let your mother walk out of here with her money and her reputation intact. It is a very generous offer." The room held its breath. The 6 high-priced lawyers stared at my 19-year-old son, expecting him to quickly grab the pen and save his mother from the legal slaughter they had just promised. They thought the threat of public ruin would easily break him. They thought they had finally regained the upper hand. Malik leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looked at the non-disclosure agreement, reading the dense legal jargon with a bored expression. Then a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. He let out a soft laugh that completely shattered the tense atmosphere in the conference room. He pushed the paper back across the table toward Derek. "I appreciate the offer," Derek Malik said, his voice smooth and entirely untroubled. "But I cannot sign that agreement. I am legally bound by a much higher authority, and your little contract would constitute a severe conflict of interest." "What conflict of interest?" Derek barked, his voice losing all its manufactured warmth. He slammed his palms onto the table, leaning forward with aggressive energy. "You do not have any interests, you ungrateful little thug. I gave you the opportunity of a lifetime. I brought you into a corporate environment and offered to wipe away your mother's financial mistakes. I offered to give you my name so you could be somebody in this city. You sit there thinking you can play games with top-tier lawyers. You are exactly what I thought you were the day I left your mother. You are a street kid who belongs in the gutter with no idea how the real world works. Preston stood up, his face turning red. He pointed his pen at Malik like a weapon. I am done playing nice with these people, Derek Preston yelled. They are arrogant and stupid. Call the police right now. Tell them the boy admitted to accessing the proprietary algorithms. Tell them he threatened to destroy our servers unless we paid him a ransom. We have 6 lawyers right here who will swear they heard him say it. We will have him locked in a cell before lunch. The real world belongs to people like me. We write the rules and build the prisons for people like you who refuse to follow them. The 6 lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, exchanging nervous glances. They were aggressive corporate bulldogs, but not fools. They sensed a dangerous shift in the room. They recognized that Preston's threat to fabricate a federal crime in front of witnesses was a massive legal liability. The lead attorney reached out and placed a warning hand on Preston's arm, but Preston violently shook him off, refusing to back down. Malik did not blink. He looked at Preston with an expression of profound pity. You really do not pay attention to anything outside of your own reflection, do you? Preston, Malik asked softly. I did not access your proprietary algorithms because you do not have any. Your entire trading platform is a disorganized mess of stolen code and fake ledgers. I did not go into your server room to steal from you. I went in there to document exactly how much you have been stealing from the blue-collar pension funds that trusted you. Derek let out a loud, forced laugh, looking at his legal team. Do you hear this, kid? Derek scoffed, shaking his head. He watches one spy movie and thinks he is a forensic accountant. You were sorting physical files in a damp basement, Malik. You do not even have a college degree yet. That is when the quiet man in the plain gray suit finally made his move. He calmly placed his cheap plastic pen down onto the yellow legal pad. The sharp click of the plastic against the wood table sounded like a gunshot in the tense room. He reached inside his breast pocket and slowly pulled out a leather wallet. He flipped it open and tossed it onto the center of the oak table, allowing it to slide perfectly to a stop right in front of Derek's thick legal binder. A solid gold badge gleamed under the bright fluorescent lights of the conference room. My name is Special Agent Thomas Vance, the man said, his voice carrying the deep, gravelly tone of absolute federal authority. I am the lead investigator for the Securities and Exchange Commission, working in direct conjunction with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I highly suggest you instruct your client to sit down and remain entirely silent, counselor. The lead attorney went completely pale. He stared at the federal badge as if it were a live grenade. He immediately pulled his hands off the table and sank back into his chair, his aggressive posturing completely vanishing. Derek and Preston froze. Their eyes darted from the gold badge to the quiet man, and then back to Malik in sheer horror. As I was saying, Malik continued, his tone perfectly conversational. I cannot sign your non-disclosure agreement because it directly conflicts with the one I signed 6 months ago with the Department of Justice. You see, Derek, I did not need your charity internship. My cybersecurity firm was contracted by the federal government to infiltrate your network and bypass your firewalls. But because your security was so poorly managed, we needed physical access to the basement servers to clone the primary hard drives without triggering your automated alarms. When you offered me the keys to the server room, you handed the federal government the exact piece of the puzzle they needed to indict you for massive financial fraud. So keep your name, Derek. I am perfectly happy with the one my mother gave me. The absolute silence that followed Malik's statement was suffocating. The 6 highly paid corporate lawyers sat frozen in their leather chairs, looking as if the floor had suddenly vanished beneath them. They were accustomed to bullying desperate mothers and intimidating small business owners. They were entirely unequipped to handle a coordinated federal sting operation orchestrated by the Department of Justice. The lead attorney slowly closed his thick binder, sliding it away from himself, as if the paper inside had suddenly caught fire. He knew that any further attempt to intimidate me or Malik could be construed as witness tampering or obstruction of justice. He looked at Derek with an expression of pure professional disgust before quietly pushing his chair away from the table. Derek was hyperventilating. His chest heaved erratically as his eyes darted desperately around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. The smug paternal mask he had worn just moments ago had completely melted away, leaving nothing but a terrified hollow shell of a man. He realized that the son he had abandoned, the boy he had tried to exploit for a cheap public relations victory, was the exact architect of his absolute ruin. He had handed the federal government the keys to his fraudulent kingdom simply because he wanted a young black man to sweep his basement floors and fetch his coffee. Preston, however, did not retreat into cowardly silence. The revelation that his massive empire of stolen wealth was crumbling did not make him introspective. It shattered his fragile ego and completely broke his grip on reality. His entire life had been built on the unshakable belief that his whiteness and his money made him untouchable. He believed he was the apex predator in any room. The realization that he had been completely outsmarted and systematically dismantled by a 19-year-old black kid and a single mother was too much for his arrogant mind to process. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson, and the veins in his neck bulged visibly against his expensive collar. "You did this!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with unhinged fury. He ignored the federal agent sitting at the table. He ignored the 6 lawyers who were actively trying to distance themselves from him. His wild, hateful eyes locked entirely onto me. "You planned this from the very beginning, Maya. You set us up. You ruined my life, you absolute witch." Before anyone could stop him, Preston snapped. He placed both of his hands flat on the polished oak table and vaulted forward, sending his heavy leather chair crashing backward into the wall. He scrambled across the wide table, kicking legal documents and water pitchers out of his way, lunging directly toward my throat with his hands outstretched like claws. He intended to physically destroy the woman who had dared to strip him of his unearned power. I did not scream. I did not flinch or raise my hands to defend myself. I did not even break eye contact with his wildly furious eyes. Before Preston's grasping fingers could even cross the center line of the conference table, a massive shadow moved from the corner of the room. The large man who had driven my car and stood silently by the door the entire morning moved with terrifying speed. He was not just a driver, but the head of my personal security detail, a former military operative who had been waiting for exactly this kind of foolish escalation. My security chief grabbed Preston by the lapels of his custom pinstripe suit and yanked him forcefully forward, using Preston's own momentum against him. With a single fluid motion, he twisted Preston's body and slammed him face first into the solid oak table. The impact echoed like a thunderclap, shaking the heavy furniture. My guard pinned Preston's left arm behind his back, applying just enough brutal pressure to completely immobilize him while pressing his face flat against the scattered legal documents. Preston gasped for air, letting out a pathetic whimpering sound as his cheek was crushed against his own fraudulent contracts. He thrashed his legs uselessly against the side of the table, completely neutralized by a man twice his size. Agent Vance stood up slowly, adjusting his suit jacket. "Assaulting a key witness in front of a federal agent is a very bold strategy," Preston Agent Vance noted calmly. "I will be sure to add that to the official indictment." I reached out and picked up my water glass. The ice clinked against the edges. I took a slow sip of the cool water, looking down at the broken, arrogant man pinned helplessly to the table. "You always lacked emotional control, Preston," I said softly, placing the glass down. "That is why you were easy to destroy." Before anyone else could move or speak, a sharp buzzing sound cut through the heavy silence of the room. It was Derek's cell phone vibrating violently against the polished wood table. He stared at it for a moment, his eyes wide with a new kind of terror. The screen illuminated, displaying an urgent message from his chief financial officer. Derek slowly reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the device. He unlocked the screen and read the text message. The remaining color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. His jaw slacked, and the phone slipped from his loose grip, clattering back onto the table. The federal government had just executed their warrants. Every single corporate bank account tied to his firm and all of his personal financial assets had been frozen simultaneously. The offshore accounts were seized. He was completely locked out of his stolen wealth. He had absolutely nothing left. The lead attorney did not wait for an explanation. He took one look at Derek's shattered expression and the federal agent sitting calmly across from him and made an immediate executive decision. The attorney grabbed his thick binder, signaled to his team of lawyers, and walked rapidly out of the conference room without saying a single word of farewell. They abandoned their wealthy client exactly when he needed them most, prioritizing their own professional survival over his rapidly sinking ship. Derek was left entirely alone with the wreckage of his life. Preston was still pinned to the table, groaning in pain as the reality of his own ruined life set in. Agent Vance stood up, adjusted his tie, and coldly informed them that official criminal indictments would be served at their homes by the end of the day. My security chief released Preston, giving him a firm shove backward. I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and walked out the door with Malik right beside me. We did not look back. Derek stumbled out of the law firm a few minutes later, his mind completely fractured by the catastrophic turn of events. He could not process the reality of his absolute defeat. He refused to accept that the woman he had discarded and underestimated for 19 years had orchestrated his total destruction. In a state of pure, desperate denial, he convinced himself that this was all a massive bluff. He thought if he could just get to me away from the lawyers and the federal agents, he could force me to undo the financial damage. He pulled a crumpled copy of the mediation paperwork from his pocket. My current residential address was printed clearly at the top of the first page. Derek walked to his car, gripping the steering wheel with sweaty hands. He programmed the address into his navigation system, expecting it to lead him to a modest apartment complex or a cramped suburban house in a bad neighborhood. He drove erratically through the busy streets of Atlanta, his panic growing with every passing mile. He practiced his aggressive speeches out loud inside the car, trying to rebuild his shattered ego. He planned to kick my door down and demand total compliance. He wanted to scream and threaten until he got his way. But as the navigation system guided him away from the city center and into the most exclusive, affluent zip code in the entire state, his aggressive, rehearsed speeches slowly died in his throat. The towering oak trees and perfectly manicured landscapes of the ultra-wealthy neighborhood began to suffocate his deep denial. The houses grew larger, and the security perimeters grew more intense. The automated voice of the navigation system announced his arrival. Derek slammed on the brakes, staring through his windshield in absolute shock. He was not looking at an apartment complex. He was parked in front of massive wrought iron security gates, flanked by towering stone pillars. Multiple high-definition security cameras tracked his vehicle immediately. Beyond the imposing iron gates, a long, sweeping driveway led to a breathtaking $15 million estate. The mansion was a stunning architectural masterpiece surrounded by lush green gardens and pristine stone fountains. It was the kind of home that dwarfed even the wildest financial ambitions he had ever possessed. He checked the address on the paperwork 3 times, matching the numbers to the brass plaque on the stone pillar. It was my house. The woman he called a financial burden owned a fortress of unimaginable wealth. Derek opened his car door and stepped onto the pristine pavement. His legs felt like lead. He walked to the gates, gripping the cold metal bars with both hands. He looked at the sprawling estate, realizing the magnitude of his foolishness. His knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed on the driveway, utterly defeated. He did not stay on the cold stone pavement of my private driveway for very long. 2 large men in dark suits emerged from the security booth at the front gate. They did not raise their voices or draw weapons. They simply informed Derek that he was trespassing on private property and had exactly 30 seconds to return to his vehicle before local law enforcement was summoned. Derek slowly pulled himself up from the hard driveway, his entire body shaking uncontrollably with fear. He stumbled back to his car and drove away, his mind completely broken by the reality of my absolute success. He spent the next 3 full days hiding inside his luxury apartment, ignoring the frantic phone calls from his panicked wife and the continuous barrage of alerts from his frozen bank accounts. By Friday morning, the financial hemorrhage of their investment firm was complete. The federal audit had publicly exposed their massive embezzlement scheme, causing their remaining legitimate clients to flee instantly. The company was officially bankrupt. Their creditors were circling like vultures, ready to tear apart whatever assets remained. That afternoon, Derek and Preston received a formal legal summons. An anonymous private equity group had aggressively purchased all of their outstanding debt and secured the rights to their corporate assets. The summons mandated their immediate presence at a board meeting to finalize the hostile takeover and sign the dissolution papers. Derek and Preston arrived at their own corporate headquarters, looking like hollow ghosts of the men they used to be. The towering glass building that once represented their massive egos now felt like a towering tomb. The lobby was entirely empty. The front desk receptionist had already resigned, and the expensive modern artwork had been formally seized by federal investigators. They took the elevator up to the top floor, standing in suffocating silence. Preston nervously adjusted his deeply wrinkled shirt collar, breathing heavily. He was clinging to a tiny shred of hope, believing he could negotiate a small severance package from the anonymous buyers to pay for his mounting criminal defense fees. Derek simply stared blankly at the elevator doors, completely numb. They walked into the grand boardroom and took their seats near the middle of the massive mahogany table. The room was eerily quiet. The server racks in the basement were currently being dismantled by government agents, leaving the building feeling hollow and dead. Derek and Preston sat anxiously waiting for the representatives of the mysterious private equity firm to arrive. They watched the large double doors at the end of the room, dreading the moment they would have to surrender the last piece of their fraudulent empire. They fully expected to see a large team of ruthless corporate men in gray suits, ready to strip their company down to the bare bone. The heavy wooden doors finally clicked open. The sound echoed loudly in the silent room, causing both men to jump slightly in their leather chairs. I walked into the boardroom wearing a sharp-tailored white suit that contrasted perfectly with the dark mahogany walls. I did not rush. I took slow, deliberate steps, letting the sharp click of my heels announce my arrival. My posture was perfectly straight, and my expression was a mask of absolute calm. I was not alone. Malik walked right beside me wearing his custom suit, looking every bit the brilliant executive he truly was. My dedicated legal team followed closely behind us, carrying the final binding dissolution contracts. Preston's jaw immediately dropped completely open in shock. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white as he stared at me in sheer disbelief. Derek did not move. He just sank lower into his chair, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute defeat. He finally realized that the mysterious anonymous private equity firm that had methodically bought up all their debt and perfectly orchestrated their total financial ruin was completely owned and controlled by me. I walked directly to the head of the massive polished table, firmly taking the executive seat that used to belong to Preston. I smoothed the fabric of my white suit and gracefully crossed my legs. Malik took the seat immediately to my right, opening a leather portfolio with quiet efficiency. My lawyers remained standing by the door, blocking the only exit. I looked down the length of the long table, letting my eyes lock onto Derek's terrified face and then Preston's sweating forehead. I allowed the heavy, suffocating silence to stretch for a few long moments, letting them feel the absolute crushing weight of their failure. I slowly placed both of my hands perfectly flat on the wood table, leaned forward slightly, and offered them a very cold, chilling smile. "Shall we finally begin this morning?" I asked. Preston could barely form a coherent sentence. His mouth opened and closed like a dying fish, while his eyes darted frantically around the room. You, he finally managed to croak, his voice barely a whisper. You bought our debt. You orchestrated all of this. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my posture completely relaxed. I did not orchestrate your poor financial decisions, Preston, I replied smoothly. I simply capitalized on them. When your firm began bleeding money to cover up your massive embezzlement scheme, you left yourselves entirely vulnerable to aggressive market acquisitions. My firm simply bought the sinking ship you were already actively drowning in. Derek shook his head violently, his hands trembling on his lap. No, this is impossible, Derek stammered. You do not have this kind of money, Maya. You are struggling. I saw the neighborhood you lived in. I saw the cheap car you drove. You are just a single mother. How could you possibly buy a multi-million-dollar investment firm? I smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. You always relied entirely on surface-level assumptions, Derek, I explained. You saw a dark sedan and assumed I was poor because you value flashy, depreciating assets. You saw me maintaining a low profile and assumed I was failing because you desperately need an audience for your fake success. I spent the last 19 years building a massive venture capital portfolio, while you spent your time stealing from union pension funds to buy luxury cars and country club memberships. I did not need to pretend to be wealthy because I actually own the institutions you desperately seek validation from. Preston slammed his fist weakly against the table, his face pale. The audit, he gasped. The federal government freezing our accounts. You tipped them off. You sent them after us to force the bankruptcy. I shook my head slowly, gesturing toward my son, who was sitting quietly beside me. I did not have to tip them off, Preston, I said. The Securities and Exchange Commission was already highly suspicious of your quarterly reports. They knew you were hiding money, but they needed hard evidence from your internal servers. They needed a digital footprint, but your firewalls were legally protected under client confidentiality clauses. They needed an inside man to legally access your physical network. I turned to look at Malik, who was already opening his leather portfolio. He pulled out a thick stack of printed network logs and placed them neatly onto the polished mahogany table. Derek and Preston stared at the documents, their confusion mounting. What does he have to do with this? Derek asked, his voice trembling. He is just a kid. He takes classes at a community college. Malik laughed, a deep, genuine sound that echoed through the quiet boardroom. I stopped taking community college classes when I was 14. Malik corrected him. I graduated from MIT with a master's degree in computer science. 2 years ago, I founded my cybersecurity firm specializing in forensic data recovery. We hold classified contracts with the Department of Defense and the SEC. The blood drained completely from Derek's face. He stared at Malik in shock. When the government needed a team to audit your corrupt servers, they hired my company. Malik continued. But we ran into a wall. We needed physical access to your basement servers to legally extract the encrypted ledgers without violating federal search parameters. We were trying to figure out how to infiltrate your building when you suddenly showed up at my birthday dinner uninvited. I watched the devastating realization slowly wash over Preston, his arrogant facade shattered entirely. You handed us the key, Preston, I said, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. You wanted to humiliate a young black man to make yourself feel superior. You gave him a diversity charity internship. You intentionally banished him to the basement to organize your physical cables and clean your server room. You gave a federally contracted cybersecurity expert authorized keycard access to the exact servers he was hired to investigate. By trying to put my son in his place, you legally authorized him to collect the precise evidence the federal government needed to send you both to federal prison. Preston grabbed his chest, gasping for air as a full-blown panic attack seized his body. The sheer irony of his downfall was suffocating. His own blatant racism, his desperate need to feel like a white savior, had handed the authorities the very rope they needed to hang him. Derek buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, pathetic sob. They had built a massive fortress of lies and fraud over a decade, only to tear it down themselves by inviting the architect of their destruction right through the front door. The sound of Derek's pathetic sobbing echoed off the dark mahogany walls of the boardroom, but it did not elicit an ounce of sympathy from anyone present. Preston, however, did not cry. The initial paralyzing shock that had frozen him to his chair rapidly mutated into a violent, unhinged rage. The pristine illusion of his untouchable white privilege had just been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. His brain simply could not process the reality that he had been completely outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and ultimately conquered by a black woman and her 19-year-old son. To a man whose entire identity was built on an unearned sense of supreme superiority, this was not just a financial defeat, it was a total destruction of his worldview. Preston suddenly stood up with such explosive force that his heavy leather executive chair crashed backward onto the plush carpet. He slammed both of his fists down onto the polished table, his face contorted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. "You think you have won?" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with desperation and fury. "You think you can just march into my building and steal my company from me? I built this firm. I cultivated these clients. This is my legacy, and you are nothing but a pair of opportunistic parasites." He was losing his mind, completely abandoning any remaining shred of corporate decorum. The carefully constructed facade of the wealthy, polished investment banker vanished entirely, revealing the vile, racist core that had always existed beneath his expensive suits. "You do not belong here," Preston spat, pointing a trembling finger at me, and then at Malik. "You do not belong in this boardroom. You do not belong in this zip code. You are just a bitter ghetto trash baby mama who got lucky with a few investments. And you," he turned his venom toward Malik, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You are a street thug playing dress-up in a custom suit. You think your little government contract makes you equal to me. I come from a dynasty. My family built this city. You are just an animal trying to steal what rightfully belongs to your betters." He hurled every racial slur and derogatory insult he could summon, filling the elegant room with his toxic garbage. He blamed us for his own criminal actions, completely incapable of taking accountability for his massive embezzlement scheme. He genuinely believed that his wealth belonged to him by divine right and that we had somehow rigged the system against him. I did not raise my voice or show any sign of anger. I sat perfectly still, watching a grown man throw a catastrophic temper tantrum. "Please continue, Preston," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "It is always fascinating to see what happens when mediocrity realizes it cannot buy true power." My words pushed him over the edge. Preston lunged forward, reaching across the wide mahogany table as if he intended to physically attack me again. But before his hands could even graze the surface of the wood, the heavy double doors at the back of the boardroom swung open with a loud, forceful bang. Preston froze mid-lunge, turning his head toward the entrance. Walking through the doors was Special Agent Thomas Vance, the same man from the mediation room, flanked this time by 4 heavily armed federal agents wearing tactical vests. Agent Vance was holding a small black digital device in his hand. He pressed a button, and a crystal-clear audio recording began to play, echoing loudly through the silent boardroom. "I will call the police tonight and tell them you stole our proprietary algorithms." The recorded voice of Preston played back for everyone to hear. "I will have you arrested for corporate espionage. You are just another statistic waiting to happen. Tell your mother to stop the takeover, or I will ruin you forever." The recording captured the exact horrific threats Preston had made against Malik in the hallway during the charity gala. Agent Vance paused the recording and looked directly at the sweating, trembling man at the table. "Preston, you are under arrest for massive wire fraud, money laundering, corporate embezzlement, and the extortion of a federal witness," Agent Vance announced, his deep voice cutting through the remaining tension in the room like a blade. 2 federal agents immediately stepped forward, grabbing Preston's arms and forcefully pulling him away from the boardroom table. Preston tried to struggle instinctively, resisting the physical control, but the agents easily overpowered him. They slammed him against the mahogany-paneled wall, twisting his arms behind his back. The cold, sharp click of metal handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed perfectly through the silent room. It was absolutely the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. The federal agents dragged Preston out his shoes, scraping the carpet as he shouted threats. The heavy doors slammed shut, cutting off his screaming and plunging the room into silence. Derek was now entirely alone. He sat paralyzed, staring at the empty space where his brother-in-law had been standing. The reality of the situation finally penetrated his delusion. There was no loophole waiting to save him. There was no investor coming to bail him out. The federal government had dismantled his fraudulent empire, and the woman he treated like garbage was sitting at the head of his table holding the deed to his ruin. Derek turned to look at me. The confident executive who crashed my son's birthday dinner was gone. In his place was a broken, terrified man. His chest heaved as panic consumed him. He slid out of his chair but did not stand up. His legs gave out and he collapsed onto his knees on the floor of the boardroom he used to rule. He crawled forward, closing the distance between us until he was positioned directly at my feet. "Maya, please," Derek begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic sob. "Please do not do this to me. I did not know what Preston was doing with the money. I swear I did not know the extent of the fraud. He manipulated me. He forced me to go along." I looked down at him. It was incredible how quickly his arrogance evaporated the moment he faced consequences. He was willing to frame his own son for a felony days ago, but now he was desperately trying to throw his business partner under the bus to save himself. "You were the regional director, Derek," I replied, devoid of sympathy. "You signed the quarterly reports. You authorized the offshore wire transfers. Do not insult my intelligence by playing the innocent victim. You enjoyed every dime of that stolen money." Derek grasped the hem of my suit jacket with shaking hands. Tears streamed down his face. "We can fix this, Maya," he pleaded. "You own the debt now. You can make this go away. We are family. Please remember that." "I am his father." He turned his face toward Malik, reaching a trembling hand out. "Malik, please tell her. I am your father. I gave you life. You cannot let them send your flesh and blood to prison." Malik looked down at the pathetic man. "My son showed no pity. You gave me DNA," Malik stated coldly. "You did not give me life. My mother gave me life. You gave me nothing but an example of exactly the kind of man I never want to be. I am not your son, Derek. I am simply the consequence of your actions catching up with you." Derek let out an agonizing wail, burying his face deep into his hands as he sobbed uncontrollably. He babbled about second chances and forgiveness, repeating the word family like a broken record. I reached into my portfolio for the last time. I bypassed the stacks of corporate acquisition documents and federal indictments. Instead, I reached into a hidden pocket and pulled out a single piece of paper. It was not a glossy legal contract. It was an old, faded document that had been folded countless times over the last 2 decades. The edges were worn, and the ink was starting to fade, but the numbers printed on it were still legible. I leaned forward, holding the piece of paper out until Derek was forced to look at it. "Do you know what this is, Derek?" I asked softly. He stared at the paper with confusion. "This is the hospital bill from the night Malik was born," I explained, my voice dropping to a whisper. 19 years ago, my water broke while I was standing in our tiny kitchen. I fell to the floor screaming in agony. Instead of calling an ambulance, you stepped over my writhing body. You grabbed your suitcase and walked out because you had a trip to Vegas planned with Preston. You said I was a burden who would only drag you down. You left me there to handle the pain alone. You threw a check in my face and told me to buy my son clothes. I continued, dropping the bill onto the floor. "Consider this your final bill." Agent Vance stepped forward from the doorway. He grabbed Derek, hauling the sobbing man to his feet. "It is time to go, Derek," Agent Vance said, pulling handcuffs from his belt. Derek did not fight back. He hung his head, weeping as the metal locked around his wrists. He was dragged out through the doors, leaving the faded bill resting perfectly on the pristine carpet, a silent monument to his failure. I left that faded hospital bill on the boardroom floor as I walked out of the building with my son. The immediate aftermath of that afternoon moved with the swift and merciless efficiency of the federal justice system. The news of the arrests hit the local media by 6 o'clock that evening, dominating the front pages of every financial publication in Atlanta. The arrogant empire that Derek and Preston had built on a foundation of lies crumbled into dust over the following months. The federal prosecutors did not hold back. They used the massive trove of decrypted data Malik had provided to build an absolutely airtight case against both men. Preston's trial was a public spectacle that completely destroyed his family legacy. He tried to hire the most expensive defense attorneys in the country, but his frozen assets and toxic reputation made him a liability nobody wanted to touch. He stood in the courtroom looking nothing like the untouchable wealthy savior he always pretended to be. When the judge handed down a sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole, Preston finally broke down. He wept loudly as the bailiffs led him away, completely stripped of the white privilege and unearned superiority that had shielded him his entire life. He would spend the next decade and a half in a small concrete cell, a fitting end for a man who believed he owned the world. Derek faced an equally devastating fate, but his punishment extended far beyond the walls of a courtroom. The moment the federal indictments became public record, his new wife Chloe enacted her own ruthless exit strategy. Chloe was entirely driven by status and wealth, and she had no intention of sinking with her husband's ship. Before Derek could even post bail, she filed for an emergency divorce. She hired a team of vicious lawyers who aggressively targeted whatever small personal assets Derek had managed to hide from the federal freeze. She claimed severe emotional distress and total ignorance of his crimes, painting herself as just another victim of his manipulation. She took his remaining luxury vehicles, drained their joint personal accounts, and legally severed all ties to the man she once proudly paraded around the country club. Derek was left completely bankrupt, abandoned by the woman he had chosen over me, and facing his own lengthy prison sentence. The ripples of their destruction eventually reached Beverly. For years, she had lived a life of unearned luxury, enabled entirely by the stolen money her son had funneled to her. Derek had purchased a stunning high-rise condominium for her in one of the most expensive districts in the city, using shell companies to hide the fraudulent funds. She had spent her days hosting lavish luncheons for her church friends, boasting about her successful son and looking down on everyone else. But the federal agents quickly traced the money trail right to her doorstep. Because the condo was purchased with embezzled pension funds, it was officially classified as seized property. I actually drove past her building on the morning of her eviction. I parked across the street and watched as federal marshals arrived to escort her off the premises. Beverly stood on the sidewalk, surrounded by moving boxes containing only the cheap personal items she was allowed to keep. She wore a faded robe, looking frail and utterly defeated as the building management changed the locks on the glass doors. The wealthy friends she had constantly bragged to were nowhere to be found. The church community she had tried to weaponize against me had completely turned their backs on her once the truth about her gambling debts and her son's thievery became public. She was forced to load her boxes into a cheap taxicab destined for a low-income housing facility on the outskirts of the city. She had spent her entire life judging others for their financial struggles, and now she was exactly where she had always been terrified of being. The fallout was total and absolute. The people who had mocked my neighborhood, ridiculed my car, and tried to steal my son's future had lost absolutely everything they valued. Their money, their social standing, and their freedom were gone forever. The universe had balanced the scales with terrifying precision. I watched Beverly's taxi drive away and felt a profound sense of closure wash over me. The ghosts of my past had finally been laid to rest. I put my car in drive and headed back to my estate, ready to focus entirely on the brilliant future Malik and I were building together. The air felt lighter and the city looked brighter. The heavy weight of their toxicity was finally lifted. I took a deep breath, smiling at the sun. 3 years had passed since that glorious afternoon under the bright Atlanta sun. while my life moved upward into a stratosphere of peace and unprecedented success. The reality for Derek was a slow and agonizing descent into absolute obscurity. He managed to avoid a lengthy federal prison sentence by turning state evidence and fully testifying against Preston, but his freedom came at the ultimate cost. The government stripped him of every single asset he possessed, leaving him with a massive mountain of legal debt and a felony record that permanently banned him from ever working in the financial sector again. He traded his custom-tailored Italian suits for a stiff polyester uniform stained with old grease and bleach. He now worked the grueling morning shift at a rundown diner on the industrial outskirts of the city, a place where the coffee was always burnt and the linoleum floors were perpetually sticky. Derek spent his days entirely alienated from the world he once believed he owned. He lived in a cramped, windowless studio apartment located above a noisy auto repair shop. His phone never rang. Chloe had long since vanished into the arms of another wealthy executive, completely erasing Derek from her memory. His mother, Beverly, constantly complained from her subsidized housing unit, but Derek could barely afford to feed himself, let alone fund her lavish delusions. He was a ghost in his own life, haunted every single waking moment by the memory of the boardroom where he lost it all. The physical toll of manual labor was rapidly breaking his body down. His back ached constantly from carrying heavy plastic bus tubs full of dirty dishes, and his hands were permanently cracked from the harsh industrial dishwashing chemicals. He who once commanded boardrooms with arrogant authority was now forced to submissively take orders from a 22-year-old shift manager who regularly screamed at him for being too slow. It was a cold Tuesday morning, and the chaotic breakfast rush had finally subsided, leaving the diner mostly empty. Derek stood behind the scratched laminate counter gripping a damp gray rag. He was aggressively scrubbing a stubborn coffee stain near the cash register, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. The only sound in the diner was the low hum of the ancient refrigerators and the drone of a small dusty television mounted high up in the corner near the ceiling. The screen was tuned to a premier national financial news network, a channel Derek used to watch religiously in his corner office. Now the scrolling stock tickers at the bottom of the screen only served as a bitter reminder of everything he had thrown away. The cheerful voice of the television anchor suddenly cut through the depressing atmosphere of the diner. The anchor enthusiastically announced that the financial world was about to witness the most highly anticipated tech public offering of the entire decade. A groundbreaking cybersecurity firm, the very same firm that had secured massive defense contracts and single-handedly revolutionized corporate data protection, was officially going public. Derek stopped scrubbing the counter. His tired eyes slowly drifted upward toward the dusty television screen. The camera angle shifted, cutting to a live broadcast directly from the iconic balcony of the New York Stock Exchange. The massive trading floor below was packed with cheering brokers and excited executives. Standing dead center on the balcony, looking out over the sea of industry titans, was Malik. He was no longer the quiet teenager they had banished to a damp basement. He was a 22-year-old billionaire CEO. Malik wore a breathtaking bespoke suit that radiated ultimate power and quiet confidence. He looked completely at ease in the center of the global financial universe. Standing right beside him, beaming with unshakable pride, was me. I wore a stunning tailored crimson dress, looking directly into the camera lenses with the calm satisfaction of a mother who had successfully protected her empire and her child. Derek stood frozen behind the diner counter, his breath caught in his throat. He watched as the countdown clock on the television screen ticked down to 0. Malik reached out with a steady hand and grabbed the wooden gavel. With a smooth, powerful motion, my son struck the opening bell. The loud, resonant chime echoed through the speakers of the small diner television, signaling the official opening of the market. The crowd on the screen erupted into deafening applause as a flurry of white and green confetti rained down from the ceiling covering the balcony. The digital ticker tape flashed across the screen, displaying Malik's company name and a starting valuation that easily eclipsed $10 billion. The damp gray rag slipped from Derek's cracked hands and landed on the dirty linoleum floor with a pathetic wet slap. He did not bend down to pick it up. He simply stared at the glowing television screen, tears of absolute bitter regret welling up in his eyes. The 22-year-old shift manager yelled his name from the kitchen, demanding he come wash a stack of greasy frying pans, but Derek did not move. He finally realized that the ultimate punishment for his actions was not the grueling poverty or the public humiliation. The true punishment was standing in a filthy diner smelling of cheap grease and failure, while watching the son he abandoned conquer the entire world without him. Thousands of miles away from that miserable kitchen, the late afternoon sun was casting a brilliant golden glow over the immaculate stone patio of our estate. The air smelled of blooming jasmine and expensive catered cuisine, providing a stark, beautiful contrast to the burnt coffee and bleach of Derek's bleak reality. We were hosting an intimate celebration to commemorate the unprecedented success of Malik's initial public offering. But unlike the stiff corporate galas Preston and Derek used to throw, filled with fake socialites and empty networking, our guest list was small and deeply intentional. There were no rented tuxedos or forced smiles here. The people laughing and sharing stories on our terrace were the ones who had actively helped build the foundation of our success. Surrounding us were the individuals who had actually mattered over the last 2 decades. My old neighbors, the ones who used to babysit Malik for free when I worked double shifts to pay for his early coding camps, were sitting by the pristine infinity pool, laughing loudly with their drinks. The brilliant MIT professors who had recognized Malik's genius and mentored him were deep in an animated conversation with my security chief. Even Special Agent Thomas Vance had dropped by wearing a casual linen shirt instead of his usual intimidating gray suit, holding a plate of gourmet barbecue and smiling warmly. These were the people who had offered genuine support when we had absolutely nothing to give them in return. They did not care about black cards or luxury cars. They cared about us. They were our true family. I watched Malik from across the patio. He had taken off his bespoke suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, looking completely relaxed and genuinely happy. He was no longer the quiet teenager forced to read a manipulative script to secure fake charity for corrupt men. He was a titan in his own right, surrounded by a community that respected his brilliant mind and cherished his unbroken spirit. He caught my eye across the crowd and raised his crystal glass in a silent toast. I smiled, raising my own glass in return. The unspoken bond between us was completely unbreakable, forged in the hot fires of early struggles and solidified by our ultimate, undisputed triumph. I stepped away from the joyful noise of the crowd for a moment, walking over to the edge of the stone terrace. I looked out over the sprawling green lawns and the towering oak trees that marked the secure boundary of our fortress. The cool evening breeze brushed past me, carrying away the last lingering shadows of our past. 19 years ago, I was a terrified young woman standing in a cramped apartment holding a newborn baby, while the man I loved walked out the door without looking back. He told me I was a financial burden. He told me I would amount to absolutely nothing without him. But sitting here today looking at the incredible empire my son and I built from scratch, I finally understand the greatest lesson the universe could have ever taught me. Blood does not make you a father, and sharing DNA does not make you a family. Family is built on a solid foundation of sacrifice, mutual respect, and unwavering presence. It is the people who stand by you when the bank accounts are empty and the nights are terrifyingly long. Derek thought his last name was a golden ticket, but a name is just a collection of letters on a page. True character and undeniable resilience are what actually build a lasting legacy. So many women are conditioned to believe that their value is inherently tied to a man who blatantly refuses to see it. We are constantly told that being a single mother is a tragic sentence of endless poverty and societal failure. But someone else's inability to see your worth never dictates your future. Their deliberate blindness is not your reality. Derek and Preston looked at us and saw nothing but easy targets. They saw a woman they thought they could easily intimidate, and a boy they believed they could ruthlessly exploit for good public relations. They were so blinded by their own unearned privilege and toxic arrogance that they completely failed to realize they were inviting apex predators into their fragile glass house. We did not just survive their abandonment and their cruel manipulation, we weaponized it. We turned their neglect into an unstoppable motivation and used their own racist assumptions to completely dismantle their fraudulent world piece by piece. You never have to shrink yourself to fit into the small, narrow minds of people who want to keep you permanently at the bottom. You build your own table, you write your own rules, and you let their absolute ruin be the loudest response to their disrespect. I took a final slow sip of my champagne, savoring the crisp, sweet taste of absolute victory. I turned my back on the setting sun and walked back toward the warm, glowing lights of the patio, where my son and my true family were waiting. The game was finally over, and we had won everything. The saga of Maya and Malik serves as a powerful testament to the reality that someone else's inability to recognize your worth never dictates your future. Derek and Preston were completely blinded by arrogance, prejudice, and a highly superficial understanding of power. They foolishly mistook Maya's absolute silence for weakness, and Malik's focused calmness for submission. The most profound lesson to extract from this story is the triumph of strategic, quiet resilience over loud, empty posturing. In a society that frequently pressures us to loudly defend ourselves against false narratives and toxic individuals, Maya chose a radically different path. She did not engage in public screaming matches, nor did she waste her valuable energy trying to convince her abusers of her inherent value. Instead, she channeled the deep pain of abandonment and the sharp sting of disrespect into building an undeniable, self-sustaining empire. Her ultimate victory was absolute precisely because it was built methodically in the shadows, far away from the desperate need for external validation that ultimately destroyed her enemies. Furthermore, the narrative beautifully redefines the traditional concepts of family and legacy. True family is not bound merely by blood or a shared last name. It is forged through mutual respect, unwavering support, and shared sacrifice. Derek believed his DNA and his stolen corporate wealth granted him automatic authority, but he learned the hard way that genuine loyalty must be earned. Maya and Malik proved that being underestimated is never a life sentence of failure, but rather a highly advantageous vantage point from which to outsmart those who carelessly take their privilege for granted. Ultimately, this story reminds us that the best defense against toxicity is massive, undeniable success. Step into your power ruthlessly, build your own table, and let your achievements be the only response your detractors ever hear.